What is your best drug story? I'll start. Story 1. Back in the day I used to go to lots of raves. This one in particular was in November 2002, in a massive marquee set up in a huge field somewhere in the south of England. At that time I was 17 and experimenting with quite a few different drugs. I can't remember exactly what I was on that night, but it would most likely be a mixture of MDMA, mushrooms, ketamine, and 2CB. It got to about 3 a.m. and due to the fact it was really cold outside and there were hundreds of sweaty ravers going for it in the marquee, it started raining inside. Yes, all the dirty raver sweat was condensing on the cold marquee ceiling, and raining back down. Now even in my inebriated state I knew this was fully rank, despite most of the other ravers taking it as a once-in-a-lifetime euphoria moment and actually catching the drops in their mouths. Massively grossed out by this, I decided to head out in the field and take a walk. Now if you've ever taken 2CB you'll know you can pretty much stare at anything and find it thoroughly entertaining. So I was walking across this field kicking my way through low-lying fog, and absolutely loving it. At which point I decided to take a piss in the middle of the field. Whilst standing there taking a piss and admiring the shapes being made by the steam coming off said piss, I noticed what looks like a massive piece of driftwood lodged in the ground sticking almost upright about 10 meters in front of me. I decided to investigate. Once I'd finished my mammoth piss, I strolled up to the driftwood to examine it. It was huge, about the size of a railway sleeper, and properly lodged in the ground almost as if Thor had decided to lob down some wood rather than his normal bolts of lightning. As I was stood debating where this wood had come from in an otherwise empty field, I noticed that on one of the sides there was a tiny red light kinda like an LED slowly blinking on and off. As I was studying this tiny red light it began to move up and down the wood very slowly. I watched it do this many times, up and down, up and down. This really threw me, and I started debating whether or not the wood and the light were really there at all. There's no reason for such a tiny moving light, and where is the electricity coming from in this empty field? Could this be just a ridiculously vivid, but otherwise massively boring hallucination? Then my mate gave me a shout to come back in the tent and I decided before I head back in, I needed to get to the bottom of this conundrum once and for all. So I decided to kick the little red light really hard, as at the time that seemed the most logical way of determining if something was real or not. As I connected the little red light, it exploded into the most beautiful firework display, splintering off into billions of tiny red sparkles, and I was hit with an amazing wave of euphoria. This euphoria didn't last long as it was pierced by a horrible booming voice from the heavens shouting, "What the fuck are you doing?" As I heard this, all the trippiness fell away, kinda like a heat wave shimmer, including the wood and the red light, to reveal an angry geezer stood over his girlfriend, with the girlfriend holding her mouth. The red light was her fucking cigarette. Not only had I taken a piss right in front of them, then walked over and stared at them in silence for what could have been 10 to 15 minutes for all I know. I then finished off by booting the girl square in the face. Story 2. There were probably 10 of us total, running around inside of a small duplex that I and 3 others lived in. We had all taken ecstasy and were all having a very good time. The night goes on, and my friend Zach asked me if I'd like to go down into the basement with him to sit in the strobe light. I told him that I would be downstairs to join him in a little bit. Almost simultaneously, everyone crashed. I was on the floor, some people were on couches, and some were upstairs, but nobody was downstairs with Zach. The next thing I know, I am woken up by the sound of crying. A male. Sobbing. I started to get up to see what was going on. I saw Zach, sitting and on the floor playing Super Nintendo. I asked him what had happened, and he suddenly got very excited and stopped crying. Dude, I was yelling at you for like 20 minutes and you wouldn't get up. Nobody would. I thought that you guys had all overdosed, and I was sitting here waiting to die. The thing that I find most hilarious was his reaction to us not waking up. He thought he was going to die, and decided to just sit down and play SNES instead of doing something about it.
Story 3. Was home for the summer and reunited the old gang to go camping at the beach. Later into the night we were all pretty drunk and stoned when someone suggested that we go for a swim. At that moment we all stripped off naked and ran hooting and howling into the Great Black Sea. So we dive in and it's fucking freezing, but you slowly get used to the cold. It was then that we noticed that our thrashing was causing the water to glow vibrantly. We quickly realized that it was the fabled phosphorescence which we had learned about from our shared favorite book, Alex Garland's The Beach. It looks kind of like this, but upon closer inspection you could see that it was thousands of tiny organisms giving off light when they moved. We stood there marveling at it and playing with it for a while, then my friend said, "Really wish we had a J-bomb right now," at which point another friend, the designated roller, came marching into the sea like fucking Poseidon, arm aloft, keeping the holiest of holies dry. And it was the best joint I could have hoped for. Story 4. Once upon a time a couple friends and I did acid in my apartment. At the time I had a disassembled television on my living room floor that was being converted into an aquarium. This being so, there were also a lot of tools laying on the floor. I thought about how I should put all of this away before we dropped, but didn't. More on that later. Starting the trip out at a friend's house was fun, but as he was not participating it was a bit strange, so we decided to go back to my apartment. I tried to open my front door, but the acid was kicking in and I forgot briefly how keys worked. I panicked and ran back to my friend's house. I explained my situation to a girl I barely knew. I gave her my keys and my phone number and she said she would call me when she got into my apartment. Eventually, she got in and I got the call. I went home and I swear I was in that apartment for at least an hour before I realized that nearly every object I own, fucking pickle jars in the back of the fridge, was turned upside down. Things settle down and the trip is going well. A friend of mine is sitting in the middle of my living room floor cross-legged. He hasn't spoke for a while, but I was tripping out and didn't realize. What happened next seemed to come at me in slow motion. I see him at one moment sitting in silence with his eyes closed, and the next moment he has a hammer in his hand, is screaming, and swinging over the head at not only my dismantled television, but also my working television. Boom. Both televisions smashed, and my buddy and I are screaming in terror. Now if you've ever had the pleasure of smashing a CRT, you know that a plume of phosphorus flakes fill the air. There were now 2 large televisions worth of phosphorus flakes in the air, and we were all freaking out at my friend. After what seemed like forever, we calmed him down and decided it was best to return to my fiend's house and deal with the mess later. We convinced crazy friend to put his shoes on and prepare to leave. He doesn't quite realize what he has done yet. We open the door to leave and he fucking ninja dives head first down the staircase. Boom, he's gone. I'm now running around the neighborhood, tripping my balls off, looking for my friend who's even worse off than me. We call other friends who are also looking for him. We split up. About 30 minutes later I alone find him. It's night at this point and I see my friend as a shadowy figure in the distance on the other side of the street. He is wearing no shirt, his pants are ripped to shreds, and he has several dozen deep cuts across his body and is bleeding profusely. I approach him, but he's so far gone he doesn't recognize me. Not wanting to startle him, he's a fucking ninja and could probably kill me with his bare hands if he wanted. I approach slowly. I try to reassure him and direct him to our friend's house. It's me, Ian Gull. Let's go relax, okay? He only grunts. He's that far gone. I get him to our friend's house and we give him some crayons to color and he rides out the trip. Now the kicker. It turns out when he dove from my apartment he ran into one of my neighbor's yards, and dove through a bunch of rose bushes tearing his cloths and cutting him. He then walked into someone's back door thinking he was home. The homeowner found crazy bleeding man in his kitchen but remained calm. My friend then takes off all of his clothes in stranger's house as an offering because he thinks he is being judged by Satan. Hands stranger his shirt and wallet and pants. Stranger gives friend pants and gets him to leave. That's when I found him. Next morning friend realizes what he has done and goes to apologize to stranger. They're now Facebook friends.
Story 5. This is my best drug story because it finally made me realize I couldn't do drugs anymore. It was March of 2011 in Queens, New York. After being clean for about a year I found myself strung out on heroin again but managing to hold a job. It was payday and I got a $1,400 check which I took directly to the bank and cashed. I decided to skip out on work early because I was starting to get dope sick. I went to a friend's house that I met at rehab who lived about 2 blocks away from my job. I call a cab and it brings my friend and I to the dealer's apartment in Bushwick, Brooklyn. The dealer knows we want 4 bundles of heroin and 10 dimes of crack. We pull up to the place and I hand Chino $430 and he gives me a plastic bag containing the drugs which I tuck into my boxers. We get back to my friend's house and I prepare my shot. The bags of heroin were stamped One Love which we had received a week prior and it was pretty weak. I think I shot about 20 bags in a day when we last got it. I decided to do a 3-bag shot as my initial dose seeing as how weak it was last time we copped. I mixed 3 bags in a spoon, dropped a cotton in and pulled the dope into my syringe. I tied off and found a vein on the first try. Most of my veins are fucked up so I felt lucky to hit so quick. As soon as I pushed down the plunger I felt the most intense rush I've ever felt doing drugs, and I am a tried and tested heroin junkie. I immediately said holy fuck as I pulled the needle from my arm and blacked out. Fast forward 40 minutes later I wake up on the kitchen floor staring up at 2 uniformed cops and 3 EMTs. I had my first overdose. The friend called them and flushed all the drugs when I collapsed. I was blue when they got to the house, and they gave me Narcan which snapped me out of it. I was taken to the hospital and observed for 5 hours then was released. I got into a cab and copped 2 more bundles of heroin in Harlem and slept on a park bench, occasionally walking to a nearby McDonald's to shoot up. I made it to work on time at 8 a.m. that morning. After this I decided to kick dope and drugs altogether and yesterday was 5 months clean.
Story 6. I was being a tourist and decided to visit Leipzig on a D2. I climbed to the top of the Volkerschaftsdenkmal which is one of the tallest buildings outside downtown Leipzig. I had a bunch of shrooms and was scoping a place to take them from atop this viewpoint. I saw next door a beautiful autumn park and monastery with a bell tower. I decided that's where I'm shrooming and proceeded to devour the batch. I took my time down the monument continuing to be a tourist and made it to the park perfectly on time. It was so beautiful. The sun was shining and the weather was so clear and warm. I'm putting my shroom face on and I'm starting to stroll and gaze when all of a sudden I see a tombstone and another and another. Oh my god, I thought this is a cemetery. What a beautiful place to rest in peace. It's so full of life. I continued to make my way to the monastery and when I got there I could feel the shrooms kicking in. It was such a beautiful building, so richly decorated with many gorgeous carvings. I'm taking photographs of every possible inch. After a few minutes I'm getting curious as to what the hell is this place. Can I see more of it? I want to see the view from the bell tower. So I start acting like an American and pushing on random doors like I own the place and can walk anywhere I want as I please, but the doors are locked. The shrooms are kicking in, I'm finding it a bit weird to walk straight and my vision is starting to warp. It was at this time some crowd walks up to me with the biggest smile on his face and says to me, "Top bis du? Don't translate just yet. The fuck? Bitte wiederholen? Please repeat." Again he comes at me with, "Top bis du? Is there something wrong with my German?" He cannot be asking me this. Auf English bitte? In English, please. He then points me to the office and everything made sense. The logo on the door said crematorium. Top bist du means are you dead? I had walked into an active crematorium in Germany. There were people dressed in black and mourning their loved. While here I am, an American on vacation, taking photographs, big smile on my face, frying a balls on mushes.
Story 8. Although I've had many crazy experiences while on drugs doing drugs, this particular instance is probably one of the best feelings I've ever gotten with a combination of drugs, including speedballs, etc. I had gotten into a bit of a hedonistic phase, doing whatever felt good really, fi best to stop that phase before you get to for crack, etc., and was well into experimenting with combinations of hallucinogens, etc., and wanted to see if I could experience one of best possible peaks, and do it as safely as possible. One night, I took a combination of about 250 to 300 of LSD, oxycodone, low tolerance at the time so probably around 40 milligrams, and marijuana. I turned on some Radiohead Kid A on in my Windows Media Player visualization and left it on in the background and loaded up some porn at the same time. At this point, I prepped a canister of nitrous and released it into a garbage bag and just started going at it. Once I was suitably aroused, I switched to the visualizer and music, and when I was nearing my vinegar strokes, I started inhaling the NO2. Now, if you've never done nitrous on hallucinogens, it has the unique effect of pretty much freezing you in time and space, peaking your hallucination and stopping it into absolute perfection. I had managed to time everything perfectly. So here I am, pants around my legs, climaxing at the peak of my trip while blissed out on weed, oxy, and nitrous. It was beautiful. Not as sick as it sounds. I swear.
Story 9. This is long but worth it. Sam took a hit of salvia and then put the pipe up to my mouth. He leaned forward and turned on the torch. In a second, the metal pipe was red hot, my lips filled with pain as they touched the hot metal. I started to suck in, drawing as much salvia into my lungs as I could. A few more seconds and Sam took away the torch, turning it off. He then pulled the pipe out of my mouth where my lips were still clasped around it. I started straight at him. The unholy amount of weed we had just smoked beforehand had gotten me really messed up, but it paled to this. I took one more look at Sam. And then it hit me. In an instant I was transported far away from Sam's basement and placed in a black void. I was standing in what seemed to be an infinite void filled with darkness. In front of me were several small glowing balls of light. In another instant a deep voice filled my head. I am Rhinonicus, the voice bellowed. And at last you shall receive punishment. It was at this point that I looked down and noticed that I was a long purple dragon with 3 metal rods jutting out of my body. I looked to me left and to my right. Surrounding me were 4 other long purple dragons, each one of them had 3 long metal rods jutting out of their bodies. I noticed that one of those dragons was talking to me, so I glanced at it. This particular purple dragon told me that he was Rhinonicus. I nodded in understanding. Then in a millisecond, Rhinonicus used his telepathy to explain to me why I was here, what my true past was. You see, in the beginning of time, Rhinonicus was born. Rhinonicus was the lowest form of life in the entire universe. Every life form was disgusted and repulsed by the mere thought of him. He was made a mockery. Rhinonicus was forced to live in a place called the Outerverse. In the Outerverse, Rhinonicus could see everything that was going on in the universe. It turns out that the balls of light I had seen earlier was actually all existence, giving Rhinonicus the perfect place to look upon everything. Rhinonicus decided that he did not want to suffer alone, so he gave birth to 3 sons. One of which was me. For an infinite amount of time, I was imprisoned in the Outerverse, condemned to a life of suffering and humiliation. But one day, without warning, I escaped. I did not intend to escape, it just so happens that I did. I escaped and fell into the balls of light. After I fell for many years, I landed on Earth. Once I landed, I became a fetus and lost any and all memory of my life as a purple space dragon. I was now live in a glass house. As I lived life as a human, thinking that I was live in a glass house, not a purple space dragon, Rhinonicus searched throughout all existence for me. His search was going on for 17 years when he found me. The instant I took the salvia, a connection between me and Rhinonicus was formed. I knew as soon as he told me all this that it wasn't just the salvia doing this. The salvia was just a gateway for Rhinonicus to access my mind. I felt ill at this sudden realization that I was not live in a glass house, but in fact I was a purple space dragon. I looked at Rhinonicus, and in a millisecond was back in Sam's basement, looking at Sam's startled face. In another second I was back in the Outerverse, once again a purple space dragon. In another second I was back in Sam's basement. This cycle of going in and out of 2 universes was really starting to scare me shitless. Fuck! I yelled, throwing myself against the bed. I was flailing my arms and legs around wildly, crying out in pain. I was close to tears. He's trying to bring me back. Rhinonicus was trying to bring me back to the Outerverse. He wanted me to serve the rest of eternity with him. He and my brothers weren't too happy I was getting out easy. I tried to explain my story to Sam, how I wasn't live in a glass house. He tried to reason with me, calm me down. As soon as Rhinonicus saw this, he stuck one of his arms and his tail into my soul. He tried his hardest to bring my soul back with him to the Outerverse. All of a sudden, I was wrenched from my seat. The next thing I knew, I was in the ceiling of a psychiatrist office, looking down at a patient and a psychiatrist. Strangely enough, the 2 people were animated. As was the rest of the office. I continued staring through the ceiling until I noticed that the two people were actually me and Sam. Sam was the psychiatrist trying to fight off Rhinonicus' grip over me while I was the patient trying desperately to explain my story. In the office, Sam was an old balding man wearing a sweater vest. But I knew it was him trying to save me. The next thing I knew, I was back in Sam's basement. I heard Rhinonicus let out a roar of defeat. A cry of anguish. He had not taken my soul. The trip was over. And what seemed like several hours was only about 30 seconds, according to Sam at least. I tried to explain this all to Sam. He caught some of it. I laid down on the bed as Sam put away the salvia. I was visibly shaken, so Sam put on Zoolander to calm me down. In a few minutes I was asleep.